And welcome back to Washington Commanders Insider. Today, we are talking about more insights from yesterday's preseason loss to the New England Patriots. And so before we go ahead and we jump into it, I first want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, just like Jaden Daniels is going to be hitting Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel, Zach Ertz, and many others for multiple touchdowns this upcoming season. And so in exchange for hitting that subscribe button, I'm going to give you nothing but daily content around the Washington Commanders. And so make sure that you hit that like, you hit that subscribe, and you join the Washington Commanders Insider family as we talk nothing but Washington Commanders football. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and let's jump into it as we're talking about some more insights from last night's loss to the New England Patriots. And so wanted to go into what Dan Quinn had to say to the press after the game. And so just paraphrasing this, we're also going to be taking a look back at some of the players that showed some flashes and some things that the Washington Commanders are certainly going to have to work on as they get ready for week 2 of preseason play. And so let's go ahead and start with Dan Quinn and his presser after the game. And so I can tell you the mood, he was not very happy at all, and understandably so. You know, this was not a great performance for the Washington Commanders, but hey, it's preseason. And so let's go ahead and jump into it. So the first thing that he talks about is looking for improvement, which I think that is really what preseason play is all about. It's about tightening things up and improving. And that's something that we're going to talk about that a little bit more here later on the show. The next thing that he talks about here is that he saw some things from Josh Connolly Jr. He also talks about Trey Amos, and he also talks about Johnny Newton. And so those three players, along with Jacory Krosky-Merritt, aka Bill, he does say, you know, definitely showed some flashes. And so I want to start with those players and starting with Josh Connolly Jr. And so got a chance to go back and look at some of the footage here from yesterday's game and just look at the individual footage around him. And I can just tell you that Josh Connolly Jr., he is a gamer because, you know, we've been talking about him in practice and just how it's been challenging, you know, going against Von Miller and things like that. And, you know, he's definitely doing some great things in practice. Make no mistake about it. You continue to hear about how he's a sponge and everything else. But this guy is a gamer because it looked like in pass protect situations, he was going out there. He was meeting the rusher. I thought that you saw some great footwork from him. I thought that you saw some great handwork from him as well, the way that he was able to punch the defender and kind of knock him off a little bit to kind of slow down the rush. I think that even at times where the rusher would kind of get wide and make the quarterback climb the pocket, it was still clean enough for Sam Hartman to make plays and things like that. I loved how he was able to get onto the initial block and then get to the second level. I mean, there were so many great things from Josh Connolly Jr. And so, look, I think that he is set to have a very good season here in year one. Obviously, this is just week 1 of preseason play. But what you have to love about what Josh Connolly Jr. did is that he was going against the Patriots starters there at the beginning. And so for him to play this well, I was very impressed with that. The next thing that he talked about too, and going back to Dan Quinn, was Trey Amos. And so circling back on him. And so I got a chance to look at some more of his just individual play there from yesterday. And so looking at some footage of just him. And man, I thought that he was terrific as far as matching up with the wide receivers. I think a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, hearing about with him, the way that he's able to just stay with wide receivers, not get too excited, and just show exactly what he's going to do pre-snap. He looks like a veteran corner out there. Yes, I understand it's week 1 in preseason play, but I loved what I saw. And I tell you what, this guy plays with a lot of juice, which is what I love about Trey Amos. In fact, if you didn't get a chance to see the play, he is tested deep, and he matches up with the wide receiver, kind of knocks him off his route just slightly, and that's what you want. And then it turns into an incomplete pass. The ball drifts out of bounds, and he let the crowd know about it because he lets them know, hey, it's an incomplete pass, and he gives them, you know, the seatbelt sign there, which is, you know, hey, he's locking him up. And so I love that with Trey Amos out there. So a ton of swagger. He also had 2 tackles on the day as well. And so I liked how he was able to come up on Ramondre Stevenson at the goal line and make a play. And so, you know, he looked very good. And so I'm right there with Dan Quinn on that one. And the next thing too, when he's talking about Johnny Newton, I thought that with Johnny Newton, yes, it was a short time that he was in the game, but for a second-year player, he had the foot injury last season. He's definitely off to a better start than he was then. And for him to get the forced fumble there on the strip sack or whatnot, you like to see that. I think that is something that Coach Joe Wood Jr. Would love to see here with this team moving forward, is getting turnovers, no matter how you do it. And so I think that Johnny Newton certainly was a bright spot here for us. And so, yes, just going back to those three players highlighted. And then also, too, not forgetting to Jacory Krosky-Merritt. And so with him, I talked about him last night. And I just thought when you go back and you take a look at him, and so just looking at some of his runs from last night, I thought that, yes, he was elusive. I thought that he was terrific as far as showing his power and lowering his shoulder. I thought that he did a great job as far as understanding where the first down marker is, putting his foot in the ground and getting there. I think that sometimes you get running backs that, they're trying to find the big play or whatnot, but he was getting there, getting to his spots. I thought he looked great, too, when he came out as a receiver and making a nice little play there. And so there was a lot to love here about Jacory Krosky-Merritt, and did get a chance to look at a little bit of a snippet of an interview with him. And so he was talking about he wanted to slow things down. And so it sounds like that he was just kind of getting a little bit ahead of himself as far as making the reads and things like that. But I'm saying to myself, like, man, if this is him, getting ahead of himself, and he ran this well, I think, in week 1 of preseason play, I can only imagine what is going to happen when they give him opportunities to get behind the offensive line with the ones out there. And so, look, Jacory Krosky-Merritt certainly looked great out there. And so continuing on with what Dan Quinn had to say in his presser. And so the next thing that he was talking about here is he was talking about just really all three phases were sloppy. And so he was just talking about that. He was not very happy with the penalties, which we're going to talk about that in a moment. And just really Dan Quinn just saying that, hey, man, all this stuff stacks. And so this is something that you definitely want to correct. He does go on to talk about the standards here. And so, yes, again, Dan Quinn not happy with what he saw there. Next thing, too, he's talking about or asked about the linebackers and stuff like that. And so, he wanted to see some stuff kind of cleaned up there, looking for some more rotations, more plays made by the linebackers. And so he does talk about that. And then he just talked about, look, how they're going to sit down, look at the footage over the next 10 days or so, and just get to a better performance, because the next game coming up, I believe, is against the Cincinnati Bengals. I believe that's nationally televised there. And so that is the next preseason game here for the Washington Commanders. And so the next thing here that he was talking about is he was asked, I think, something about the wide receiver play. And, he's talking about they're still trying to find some players who can emerge. And so, again, this is week 1 of preseason play, but he does mention that Luke McCaffrey was coming in a little bit under the weather there, but he still gave it a go. And so that is a note here about Luke McCaffrey, that he was a bit under the weather coming into this thing. And then also, too, he talked about, he saw some good things from Jalen Lane and then Chris, which I think he's talking about Chris Moore. And so he saw some things that were good there. Obviously, some things that they need to clean up. But again, just reiterating what Dan Quinn talked about, is just saying that the standards and just how the Commanders want to play just unacceptable with this game. And so this is something that he wants to keep the standards high in this building. And so that is what Dan Quinn had to say. And now that just leads me into just some more points and just insights out of this game. And so, going into the turnovers and, piggybacking a little bit off of what Dan Quinn said, he was talking about the pre-snap turnovers. That is where you're jumping, offsides, you're in the incorrect formations, all the stuff like that. And he was talking about like how that is just, it's all mental, first of all. So even if it is a hold and it occurs during the play, it is something that you have to correct those things. And so when I think of turnovers, I think of it like this, that this is so important in any sport. And I mean, any sport, and not just sport. I mean, I think that this also translates to life as well, when you're talking about going against yourself. And I just think that the way this team ended the season last year, All right, getting beat by the Eagles 55-23 and not taking anything away from the Eagles. I mean, they went on, they beat us. They obviously won the Super Bowl or whatnot, but there were 4 turnovers in that game. Then also, too, going back to when the Washington Commanders beat the Eagles 36-33, there were 5 turnovers there. And so, look, you cannot expect to win at a high level when you're turning the football over. And coming into this season, this had to be, on the chalkboard here is that, look, we cannot beat ourselves. And I just remember just being a competitor out there. And when you go back and you look at the tapes and things like that, you have to ask yourself, did you get beat by the other team or did you beat yourself? And I think that if the Washington Commanders put themselves in positions where they say, hey, the other opponent beat us, I think that they're going to come out on top more times than none here. And so I think that that is one of the key things that the Commanders are certainly going to have to button up, and that is the turnovers. And so the next thing too, talking about these penalties and stuff like that is something that you just have to get better at. And so I understand that penalties do happen. I understand that, look, a lot of these guys, you're trying to evaluate them and everything else, and you're kind of mixing and shuffling the roster up there. You're trying to figure out, okay, yes, we're throwing some 2s maybe out there with our 3s or whatnot, because you're trying to figure out, okay, who can make this roster? Who can we put them into certain situations? All that. I get that. But penalties are definitely something that it comes down to the focus point. And so you have to absolutely clean this up going into week 2 against the Cincinnati Bengals, because look, I think that when you're cleaning up these penalties and you're cleaning up these turnovers, stuff like that, it's stuff that does stack up. And I know a lot of people look at preseason and say, well, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters even if you're playing in the Turkey Bowl somewhere. You don't want to have those principles as you move on in your season. And so this is something that the Commanders certainly are going to have to correct. The last thing too, in just an insight that I saw here from last night for me is the personnel. And when I start to think about the personnel, for me, I start to think about the wide receiver group. And I think about this because we know what Deebo Samuel can do. And we've been hearing about that in practice, everything else. We know what Jaden Daniels is going to be able to do. And I think we certainly understand what Terry McLaurin is going to bring to this team as well. However, there is going to have to be somebody else that steps up. There just is going to have to be. And so right now with Noah Brown, he's working his way back from an injury. I'm sure that we'll figure that out and see what's going on with that, because, there was a slow ramp up period with him, and obviously he's been practicing or whatnot. And so we still really don't know what that injury was. But, I think that Noah Brown is somebody they're going to have to depend on. But if he does get injured, and even if he is still out there, somebody else is going to have to step up. And so, unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to see, too much from Luke McCaffrey out there. I thought that we saw a lot here from Jacory Brooks, undrafted rookie. And so he's a guy that I'm expecting that hopefully he does make the team. But for a guy like Luke McCaffrey, Ben Sinnott, these guys that were here in year 1 last season, somebody's going to have to step up, because if Terry McLaurin is not there in week 1, keyword if, he's not there in week 1, somebody is going to have to step up. And it gets challenging because now, instead of you going against maybe the 3rd or 4th best corner, when you have to move up the depth chart, now you're going to go against their 2nd best corner, or so on and so on. And so these are things that the Commanders are certainly going to have to work on. And that's like one of the personnel groups that I'm circling going forward in preseason play. The next thing too, for me, just looking at this, is going to be the line to scrimmage, and really starting with the defense. I think with them defensively, we didn't get off to a great start as far as stopping the run. And so I know it's preseason. I get that. And, a ton of comments. I understand that. But still, when you're talking about stacking stuff, you got to be able to stop the run. And I've said this a couple shows back that I think that we're going to find out about this team hopefully by week 5, as far as, how good they are against the run. And I just think that you have to take these preseason games. You need to set that standard. You need to understand, hey, we set the edge this way. We understand that we need to be here in our run fits and things like that. This is super important. And so hopefully the Commanders are able to tighten that up. These are 2 of the positional groups that I'm looking forward to seeing here. And then next, when you look at the offensive line, I thought I was impressed with what I saw there in week 1, the way that they were able to open up some running lanes and stuff like that. Would they probably have liked to go back and probably take down some of those pressures from the Patriots? Sure. But I think for week 1, not bad. They're going to have to clean up the mental mistakes there, but this is something that I think that everybody can certainly do. And so anyway, we'll see what happens with this. Just some more insights about this game as the Commanders lose to the Patriots 48-18. You guys let me know in the comments what you guys are thinking as far as your insights. Remember, the Commanders are back to practice here Sunday, so we'll be talking about the key standouts, performances, and what players and coaches had to say following that practice. And I'm sure we'll get some more insights as to what happened here into week one. And also, too, another key out of this is that Dan Quinn did say that in the presser, we're going to get some injury updates. And so we will find that out. And so we'll be talking about that. But you guys let me know what you guys are thinking from this loss against the Patriots. Again, it is just a week one preseason loss. In 4 weeks or so, this is going to go back to 0-0, but you got to set the right habits right now. So anyway, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And as we always say, go Commanders, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.